Today I'm going to be continuing my discussion of the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams. I'm going to be focusing in particular on foreign policy issues, diplomatic crises that emerge during these two presidencies, and how both Washington and Adams dealt with these in different ways in an attempt to try and maintain America's position as an independent sovereign nation without being drawn into a European war. So to begin with, war is going to break out in Europe as a result of the French Revolution. And this is another good example of how, even though we are an independent nation, free of European rule, what's going on in Europe is still going to have a big impact on what goes on here in the United States. We're still have very close ties to Europe, both England and France, and as a result, the European issues that are going to break out in war again, will end up spilling over into the United States and risk drawing us into yet another conflict. So in a nutshell, without turning this into a European history class, the French Revolution begins in 1789. The lower classes of France rose up in an attempt to gain some sort of liberty and equality, which was, of course, their motto, against the ruling classes, the nobles and the clergy. In an attempt to do this, of course, this is in response to centuries of oppression of the lower classes and a revolt against the monarchy in particular. What will happen, though, is that in the early days of the revolution, from our perspective, it looks like the French are engaged in a noble cause. Fighting for liberty and equality, both ideals that Americans can identify with at this time. So initially, there's a lot of sympathy for the French people who are rising up and attempting to throw off the shackles of oppression. However, within a year or so, this revolution turns very ugly. It gets very brutal and bloody and violent. And the initial causes that sparked the revolution give way to radicalism, and it ends up being a disaster, a mess for France. And what happens is that, from our perspective here in the United States, there will be differing views. This European conflict that just broke out is going to polarize American politics. Many in Congress and the American people will sympathize with France and their cause of liberty and equality. Some in America will take the opposite position. They will see the brutality and the violence and the radicalism as an indication that this French Revolution is nothing at all like our own recent revolution, and they will want to distance themselves from this conflict as much as possible. So we've got a political debate within the United States government and the United States public over the issues that concern this French Revolution. Well, in early 1793, the King and Queen of France will be executed by this radical revolutionary mob. And in the power vacuum that ensues, a French military officer named Napoleon will rise to power, and he will assume leadership of France as a dictator. And here's where it starts to involve us. Once Napoleon assumes leadership in France, he attempts to export these ideals of French Revolution to the rest of Europe. And this is where the real conflict begins. Prior to Napoleon, the French Revolution was an internal matter. It was strictly a French matter. Once Napoleon takes over, it becomes a European matter, with French armies attempting to spread revolution and overthrow monarchies in other countries in Europe. England in particular is going to be disturbed by this, and is going to start pushing back against France. So essentially, these Napoleonic wars that take place, from 793, which is the end of the French Revolution, basically, to 1815, and we're looking at about 20 years worth of, almost 25 years worth of war in Europe as a result of this French Revolution. Basically, it's going to be France against Europe. Spain and England and several other countries are going to fight against France in an attempt to try and stop Napoleon, and that's going to drag on for many years. how that affects us is that both England and France will try to recruit us to their side of the conflict. France, for obvious reasons, wants us to join on their side because there's some history between us. They helped us out during our revolution, and they they believe that we're now obliged to help them in their cause in Europe. Of course, now that they are exporting this war to all the countries of Europe, it's quite a bit different than our revolution, and many in America believe that we should not get involved with France because we are not in the business of helping another country wage war against its enemies, especially when that country was the one that started it. So what ends up happening is that within our Congress, the Federalists tend to sympathize with England in this Napoleonic War, and the Republicans tend to side with France. They see a lot of the ideology, despite the radicalism of the French Revolution. Many of the Republicans here feel that we have enough in common with France to warrant our supporting them. And of course, the Federalists, who primarily Northerners, businessmen, and so forth, they benefit greatly from a relationship with England. And if we choose the side of France, then they stand to lose a lot in terms of a war against England. So we're in a kind of a tight spot here. France wants us to join the war on their side. Now, while England is not actively trying to recruit us, there are some among the Federalists who believe that if we join this war, it should be on the side of England. So we've got two camps now divided along party lines regarding our position on this European war. Now, in addition to just the political debate over this war in Europe, we've also got some other issues we need to deal with, because the French are actively trying to recruit American support. We get a new French ambassador shows up in the United States right along the time of about 1792, 1793, and this new ambassador, a guy named Edmond Genet, he's attempting to drum up support for the French cause. He hires American privateers, or merchant pirates, basically, to attack British ships. He tries to enlist an army of frontiersmen to attack Spanish possessions in Louisiana. He even goes so far as to start French revolutionary societies here in the United States and try to pressure the American government to join the war with France. So this goes on for a while, and George Washington has had about enough of this conspiring and recruiting, and he calls the French ambassador into his office and basically sticks his finger in his face and says, "Look here, you either cease and desist all your recruiting efforts, or I'm going to have you deported." And of course, the French ambassador quickly comes to heel, because he doesn't want to be deported, because that means he'll have to go back to France, where he will almost certainly be executed, because by this time, the revolution has already taken its radical turn, and this ambassador would almost certainly end up on the guillotine. So the French ambassador quiets down, and he stays here in the United States, but he doesn't try to recruit anymore. But that doesn't mean the problem goes away. We end up in a situation where George Washington, at this point, he declares that the United States will remain neutral. We will not join the war on either side. We will remain friendly and amicable toward both sides, both England and France. And it's his intention to continue trading, to continue diplomatic relations with both of these countries, because he does not want us to be drawn into this war. And this is one of the ways, one of the other ways that George Washington is very clever, very smart man. He knows that despite political support for joining the war on either side, Washington knows that if we join this war in our current state as a new fledgling nation who's barely trying to get on its feet, it could mean disaster for us as an independent nation. Should we end up on the losing side of this war, we could lose everything. As is tradition, the loser in most European wars will end up giving up territory or giving up its sovereignty, or both. And George Washington knows we can't afford to do this. Even if we didn't lose, we don't really have any resources to commit to this war. Our entire United States Army is less than 3,000 men. So we don't really have the resources to provide France to support their cause. Of course, if we did call up the militia to create an army, the states would take issue with that because not many states really supported giving up troops to go fight a war in Europe. So there's really not a lot of good reasons for us to join this war. So George Washington declares that we will remain neutral and that we will not participate in this war, but we will continue to maintain diplomatic and trade relations with both England and France. And that's kind of where our problems really begin, is our attempt to play both sides, or to stay friendly to both sides while they are fighting each other. What will end up happening is that both England and France will begin to attack our merchant ships. As our merchant ships go to England and France to continue trading, each side will attack our ships in an attempt to prevent them from supplying their enemies. So our American ships that are headed to England will be attacked by French ships to prevent them from trading with their enemy, and vice versa. So in the first few years of this war, America takes a beating in terms of our merchant fleet. We end up losing quite a few ships. Between 1793 and 1794, U.S. loses about 600 ships are seized between England and France, and this is a lot of ships in the space of just about a year, a little over a year. We can't afford for this to continue on at this rate. We've got to do something about this. Even though we want to remain neutral, it's clear that we can't just completely turn our back on the issue. We're going to have to get involved in some way. So George Washington here is going to attempt to try and negotiate our way out of this, try to get England and France to stop attacking our merchant ships. So he focuses his attention on England primarily, because England, more so than France, is attacking our ships. The bulk of our ships that were seized by British naval vessels. So what he does in 1794, he sends Chief Justice John Jay to England to try to negotiate some sort of settlement and get them to stop attacking our ships. Again, since England was the primary perpetrator of these attacks, Washington decided to focus his attention on England. So first of all, I need to address why John Jay, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, is on a diplomatic mission. Typically, this mission would fall to the State Department, who is headed by Thomas Jefferson. However, Thomas Jefferson is the chief Republican. He's kind of the head of the Republican Party, and he's a strong opponent of England and a strong sympathizer toward France. It's not really a good idea to send Thomas Jefferson to England when he's such a French sympathizer. So Washington decides to err on the side of caution here and send someone else to England to do this negotiation. And that fell to Chief Justice John Jay. Hence the name of the treaty. When Jay gets to England, he speaks with the British Foreign Minister, and they iron out an agreement. Basically, this ends up being more of a trade agreement than anything else. His goal is to get England to stop attacking our ships, but England won't promise to do that. Basically, England says, look, you all are trading with our enemy, and as long as you are trading with our enemy, France, we will continue to prevent that in any way that we have to, which includes attacking your ships. So we're going to continue to attack any ships headed toward France because we don't want them to gain an advantage over us. We're sorry that it has to be your ships, but that's just the way it is. So instead of just dismissing us completely, they refused to make this promise, but they did offer some attempt at reconciliation. England offers to compensate us for the ships that they've already seized, and of course this is a significant amount of compensation here. They pay us back for the ships and the cargoes that they've seized, and in return we agree to relax our tariffs on British imports. So this kind of turns into a trade agreement at this point. England offers to abandon all of its forts on our frontier, and that's an issue that's been kind of ongoing. This doesn't really happen overnight. In fact, Their forts on our frontier will continue to be a minor issue in the years to come, but they do make a stronger commitment to remove those troops. And finally, they offer us trading rights in their colonies in India and the Caribbean. So we didn't get what we wanted out of this treaty, which was them to agree to stop attacking our ships. But we did get a more positive trading arrangement with England, and that'll of course benefit us economically. When Jay comes back and with this treaty and presents it to the president, and of course Congress, the Senate must ratify this treaty. A lot of people are highly critical of this treaty because they feel that we got shortchanged here. We didn't get what we wanted, which was them to stop attacking our ships. And most of the trade agreements that were part of this treaty tended to favor England more than they favored us. So a lot of people will criticize this treaty as kind of England taking advantage of us. Even though the Senate will ratify the treaty and it will go into effect, it still receives a lot of criticism, especially from Republicans who were not big fans of England anyway. What is important about this is that it does keep us from going to war with England. And this is important, especially in the eyes of George Washington, who realizes our precarious situation. We are in no condition, militarily or economically, to fight another major war at this time. So that was first and foremost our main priority. We avoided war with England, and that's important. In addition to that, the fact that England was willing to sit down with us and negotiate this is further acknowledgement of our sovereignty, and this is important. This shows that England still recognizes us as an independent sovereign nation and not just some inconsequential little colony that isn't worth dealing with. So this is important, although it's kind of intangible. You can't really point to it and touch it and see something real, a result of this treaty. It is important because England still acknowledges us as an independent country, and it's important for our credibility in the international community that these nations continue to acknowledge us. So Jay's treaty is kind of a mixed bag. We did get some benefit out of it, but we didn't get what we wanted. A second little piece of foreign policy that's going to take place the following year is a treaty with Spain. And this treaty is directly concerning our border dispute with Spain over Florida. If you remember, when the revolution was over and we signed the Treaty of Paris 1783, Spain got control of Florida, but a border between the United States and Florida was never specified. And that became a source of a lot of confusion over the years, both Spain and the United States claiming territory that overlapped. This Treaty of San Lorenzo is an attempt to rectify that issue. In fact, this works out really well for us. First and foremost, Spain approaches us with this treaty. A guy named Thomas Pinckney, who was the U.S. ambassador to Spain at the time, while he's in Spain, the Spanish government will approach him. The Spanish foreign minister approaches Pinckney and offers him a treaty. And so we would like to work out a deal with the United States, with your country, to formalize the border between the United States and Florida. One of the reasons that Spain is so conciliatory at this point is that in 1795 they've got their hands full with this European war. They're fighting France and Napoleon, and of course a lot of people are still unsure whether we're going to join the war with France, and Spain is trying to get out in front of this issue here by trying to make peace with us on a separate issue in an attempt to try and formalize or settle our relationship so that they don't have to deal with us and France. They've got their hands full with France right now, and Spain is in kind of a precarious situation too, and they don't need any additional enemies. So they want to make friends with us, and they offer this border resolution as the little olive branch here. So what will happen as a result of this treaty, taking a look at our map here just to kind of refresh our memories where we're talking about, we're looking at the border between the United States and Spanish Florida. This territory had long been claimed by both the United States and Spain, and no one could prove their claim to it. What Spain is offering us here is they are offering to to give us the border that we want. You basically extend the current border between Florida and Georgia, just extend it all the way to the Mississippi River, and we will call this the official border between the United States and Spain. In addition, they're offering us free navigation of the Mississippi River and the Port of New Orleans, both of which are controlled by Spain. And this is important to us because our frontier farmers, especially in the Ohio River Valley, their best and easiest access to the East Coast trade ports is down the Mississippi River. With Spain in control of the Mississippi and New Orleans, it's very difficult for us to gain access to these ocean ports without interference by Spain. Spain is now offering to let us have free navigation of the river and access to the port of New Orleans. So this will be a big benefit to us in terms of trade and commerce, and of course just easy access to the frontier. So Pinckney's treaty, or this Treaty of San Lorenzo, is kind of a big win for us in terms of diplomacy and international relations. The after our deal with Spain is settled, we're going to be faced with a new president. We're going to have a presidential election in 1796, and this is going to come as a surprise to some people. A lot of people in Congress and the people of the United States were under the impression that George Washington would continue to serve as president for at least another term. Keep in mind there are no term limits on presidents at this time. The Constitution never specified any kind of term limits. So in theory, the president could serve as many terms as he could get elected for. And a lot of people wanted George Washington to continue serving as president. But Washington made kind of a surprise announcement in 1796 that he would be retiring from political life and that he would no longer be serving as president. So we're now faced with a situation where we need to elect a new president, someone other than the incumbent. So John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both will throw their names in the hat. John Adams, of course, is Washington's vice president, and Thomas Jefferson is currently the Secretary of State. Now, before Washington leaves office, he makes a kind of a farewell speech, and he's giving one last little bit of advice to Congress and to the nation as a whole. And he's speaking specifically with regard to this issue with England and France. He first of all, he's kind of really disappointed that the United States has polarized itself with this issue. Washington never liked the idea of political parties. He was strongly against political parties, or partisan politics as they call it. In fact, he found the whole thing rather disgusting. But he felt that it was not his place to dictate whether or not political parties should be allowed to function. So he says the Congress has chosen this, the American people have chosen this idea of political parties. It's not my place to condemn that. But he gives one piece of advice. He tells them to avoid entangling alliances. And he's speaking specifically to this ongoing issue with France, and France's attempt to recruit us into their war in Europe. George Washington, he's against us getting involved in foreign wars because he believed that it would be very detrimental to us as a nation, especially in these early years. And he feels that this is important enough to he's trying to use his influence to get the next president or the next administration to continue this policy of neutrality and not get involved in European affairs. So entangling alliances, as he refers to it, is kind of it's a commitment to fight with someone else. Basically, the way I like to put it in terms of a metaphor that we can all relate to, you've got a best friend. You've been best friends your whole life. You went to elementary school together. You played Little League together. You went to high school and college and so on and so forth. You've been friends for life. And you take an oath with this best friend of yours. Hey, I've got your back no matter what happens. I'm always going to be there for you because you're my best friend. Well, one night you're downtown partying at the nightclub, and you see your friend at the other end of the bar. He's hitting on some of the guy's girlfriend, and you know that this is going to end in disaster. Of course, the girl's boyfriend walks up, and he's about 6'5" and 300 pounds, about 3 feet wide at the shoulder. This guy is huge, right? You know your friend is about to get his ass kicked. But you've made an oath to always defend, always have your friends back. Now, here's the problem, and this is what George Washington was talking about. You've made an alliance with this friend. You've agreed to always have his back. But here he has started something on his own. He's not being attacked out of nowhere. He has gone and he has started this trouble all on his own. He's brought this on himself. So you're wrestling with this moral dilemma. Do I go and help my friend, even though he probably deserves what's coming to him, or do I let him just take a fall? So, because if you go down there and help your friend, you're probably going to get beat up too. And this is what George Washington was afraid of. If we make an agreement to fight other people's wars, it's fine if we're coming to their aid when they are being attacked. But if they attack someone else and then expect us to help fight the war with them, that creates a lot of problems for us. And George Washington hoped to help us avoid this sort of situation in the future. Now, as a testament to George Washington's influence and the amount of respect that people had for him, the United States followed this tradition for almost all of its history, up to the mid-20th century. The United States never entered into any kind of entangling alliances or commitments to fight alongside other countries until the years right after World War II, with the formation of NATO. So even though this was never a formal policy, it was never part of U.S. law that we would always remain neutral, but it was just kind of an unwritten tradition. We did not get involved in any kind of formal alliances, just because George Washington had recommended. But now we'll fight in other wars. World War I, World War II, both foreign wars the United States will participate in, but we never formed any permanent alliances for those wars. We agreed to fight on one side during that war, and then that was it. Not until after World War II, the beginning of the Cold War, did we enter into a formal alliance with other countries for that purpose. So again, Washington leaves this message for the next president, be it Thomas Jefferson or John Adams. Washington wants this tradition to continue. So in 1796, we'll have an election, Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams for President of the United States. Adams, of course, being the Federalist candidate and Jefferson being the Republican candidate. And keep in mind, this election will take place only within Congress. There's no popular election for president at this time. Only the Electoral College will vote for president. What's interesting here is that the Constitution had never considered the possibility of partisan politics. So, according to the Constitution, the method for electing a president is that the candidate with the most number of votes will be president, and the runner-up, or the candidate with the second most votes, will become vice president. And that's what happens in this 1796 election. John Adams will win the most votes, and he will become president. Thomas Jefferson comes in second, and he will become vice president. And you should already be able to see where this is going. Adams and Jefferson are from two different parties, and they are staunch political rivals at this point. Now, whereas years ago they started out as friends, they were very friendly and amicable toward each other. As a result of this election, and of course the years leading up to it, Adams and Jefferson are kind of bitter enemies. So what ends up happening is we got the president and vice president who don't get along personally or politically. They represent two different political ideologies, and this is going to make for a difficult time, a lot of tension over the course of Adams' presidency, when his vice president is kind of undermining him at every turn. And this is not the only problem. Adams himself is going to have a weak presidency because of some of his personality conflicts. He's very intelligent, and that kind of made him a little bit arrogant and aloof. And he was hard to work with. He didn't work well with others. He made a lot of people kind of insulted and aggravated a lot of people. Thomas Jefferson wasn't much better. Thomas Jefferson also very intelligent and somewhat arrogant and bitter because he lost the election and has to work for his political enemy. Jefferson will turn kind of passive aggressive on John Adams. When the president comes to seek advice with the vice president, as is common tradition, Jefferson will get kind of indignant, and he'll be like, "Well, I don't know what you're asking me for. I'm not the president." So he kind of undermines Adams a little bit, and the tension between these two, coupled with the tension within Congress between the Federalists and Republicans, creates an environment where not a lot's going to get done over Adams' single-term presidency. So a lot of problems are going to be resulting from this tension between Adams and Jefferson. And of course, this tension will also just kind of reinforce and add to the problems that they're going to have with foreign policy. Whereas Adams is trying to keep us out of the war altogether, Jefferson believes that we should enter the war on the side of France. So this is gonna create more problems for us diplomatically as well. And to make matters worse, France is going to look at this situation. France is aware of the politics in America. France is aware that Adams, the new president, is a sympathizer of England and is opposed to French alliance. So France is going to be kind of angered about this, and France is going to see the United States as kind of a threat now. And plus, France also looks at this Jay's Treaty that we just signed a couple of years or the year prior. They perceive it as an alliance between England and America, which of course it's not. It's just a trade agreement. But France sees this as an alliance, and we now become the enemy of France. And they start attacking our ships at even a higher rate than England had been. So we've got a lot of problems with France now. We kind of settled things down a little bit with England. I mean, they're still attacking some of our merchant ships, but our main problem now is France. France sees us as their enemy. They feel betrayed by us. The fact that we won't join them, and the fact that the new president, John Adams, is a sympathizer of England. France now sees us as their enemy, and they start attacking our ships. Well, at this point, within the first 3 months of Adams' presidency, France seizes over 300 U.S. merchant ships. And at this rate, at about 100 ships per month, America won't last long economically. Eventually, we'll have no ships to trade with, and we will be out of business. So in 1797, President Adams is going to send a guy named John Marshall on a diplomatic mission to Paris to try and see if he can negotiate some sort of a ceasefire or something with France. John Marshall, FYI, will later go on to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. At this point, though, he is simply on a diplomatic mission to try and get France to stop attacking our ships. When Marshall gets to Paris, he's expecting to meet with the French foreign minister, and instead the French government sends 3 unnamed bureaucrats out to meet him, and the bureaucrats demand a bribe of about $250,000, and then of course they insist on the United States giving France a $12 million loan before the government will even agree to meet with Marshall. So obviously Marshall is kind of in a bind here. He's like, hey, I didn't come here to hand out bribes or to authorize loans. That's not the purpose of my mission. I'm just going to have to go and check back in with the president. So Marshall comes back to the United States empty-handed and reports to the president. In his report to the president, he mentions these 3 unnamed bureaucrats from the French government as X, Y, and Z. He doesn't remember their names, so he just refers to them as X, Y, and Z. Of course, the press will hear about this. They'll get a hold of this, and the story that appears in the newspaper is the XYZ affair. So that's where we get the name for this term. At any rate, Adams is furious. He's trying to do things diplomatically and reach out to France in the same way we reached out to England a few years earlier, but France pretty much slams the door in our face. So basically, Adams, a lot of people at this point, especially when this XYZ affair hits the press, a lot of people in the American public are calling for war with France. A lot of the hardliners hardline Federalists in Congress are calling for war against France. Adams, however, just like George Washington, he knows that we are in no shape to fight a war against France. So he is going to try to take further steps to address this situation without actually taking us to war. So this diplomatic crisis between us and France prompts Adams to take more defensive actions. Instead of declaring war against France, he decides that maybe a buildup of our own defenses might be worthwhile, so that we can at least protect our ships from French attacks. So what Adams does is he asks Congress to basically, this is more of just kind of a gesture, a symbolic gesture. He tells Congress to tear up our old treaty with France from way back in 1778, from our revolution. He says, tear up that treaty, throw it away. We're no longer. I don't want to have anything to do with France at all. So that was more, like I say, just a symbolic gesture. But he also asks Congress to authorize the creation of a navy. We had previously done this when we first formed the Constitution. We allowed for the creation of a navy, but we didn't really have a navy. It just said so on paper. But here, Adams is asking Congress for money to actually start building warships. And Congress approves this. We build 40 new warships specifically for the purpose of forming a navy. And again, we're going to try and defend our own coastal waters, defend our own merchant ships with our own navy instead of just hoping France will leave us alone. He also asked Congress to triple the size of the army, which they did. So now our standing army is 3 times as large, and we now have an actual navy that we can defend ourselves with. Well, of course, France is going to continue attacking our merchant ships, and with our newly formed navy, we will defend our merchant ships, and this results in what we call a quasi-war with France that takes place along our coastal waters and in the Caribbean. A quasi-war basically is quasi is just a fancy Latin word for kind of, sort of, maybe, but not quite. We're fighting. Our navy is fighting the French navy in the Caribbean, as pictured here in this artist's painting. It's an undeclared war. There's no official declaration of war here on either our part or the part of the French. We catch French ships trying to attack our merchant ships, and our navy will engage those French ships in mostly small-scale skirmishes, single ship battles. It never escalates into any kind of full-scale warfare. Very small scale. And of course, this illustration here, this is the USS Constitution, one of our first official naval vessels, and engaging a French ship here in this quasi-war in the Caribbean. Just a little piece of trivia for you. If you're interested in historical landmarks or historical sites, museums, that sort of thing, the USS Constitution is technically still in commission or in service to the U.S. Navy. It's anchored in New York Harbor at a U.S. Naval Museum. So technically, while it is a museum, it's technically still in the service of the United States Navy. Just FYI. So the quasi-war with France will go on for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years. We'll have this on again, off again skirmishing in the Caribbean with us trying to defend our merchant ships from French attacks. And eventually, they will sue for peace as the war in Europe starts to turn against France. France will be looking to simplify its efforts a little bit, and they will offer us a peace agreement. And we'll talk more about that when we get into Thomas Jefferson and James Madison's presidency. But for now, we are in an undeclared war with France in the Caribbean. The diplomatic issues are going to continue to aggravate politics here in America. A lot of Federalists, the hardline Federalists in Congress, are calling for an open declaration of war against France. But this quasi-war is kind of the best balance between the two, between doing nothing and between an open declaration of war. And again, this is Adams' attempt to try and keep us from getting involved in a deeper war with France. But Congress, Federalists in Congress, are not satisfied that this is enough. Keep in mind, Federalists are sympathetic with England, and they are strong opponents of France, whereas the Republicans are very sympathetic toward France. Now, these hardline Federalists in Congress are concerned that if we did happen to end up in a full-scale war against France, that these Republican sympathizers might be tempted to try and subvert the U.S. government in an attempt to ally themselves with France. And they're concerned that we could end up in a civil war over our involvement in this French war. So the hardline Federalists in Congress are going to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798 as a way to kind of prevent this. Now this is gonna be kind of touch and go here, because they're going to rationalize this Alien and Sedition Act by using the emergency, the current crisis with France, these attacks on our ships and this quasi-war. They're going to rationalize these acts by saying they're protecting us from enemy subversion, namely France. But the underlying reason for these laws are to basically undermine political oppositions, specifically the Republican Party. In a nutshell, these Alien Sedition Acts, and there were 4 separate pieces of legislation, 4 separate acts, but we're going to think of them as a collection, as a single collection of acts. So the description I'm about to give you is basically a description of all of these acts, not just any one single act. Basically what happens is that these Alien and Sedition Acts will authorize the president to deport anyone or any foreigner who is suspected of subversive activity. And of course, subversive activity is very vague. That could be anything from handing out leaflets to recruit for the French army, or speaking out against the U.S. government. So basically any foreigner who is deemed subversive can be deported. It also extends the naturalization process for citizens from 5 to 14 years, making it a little bit more difficult for immigrants to become citizens. The big one, though, is the Sedition Act, and this is the one that people get so upset about during this time. Basically, the Sedition Act makes it a federal crime to speak or write anything critical or scandalous or malicious toward the United States government. And I'm sure, as you're already thinking, you'll agree this is a clear violation of the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and so forth. The Sedition Act basically says it's now a federal crime to speak or print anything critical of the United States government. Now, again, they passed this. Of course, the Federalists maintain a majority in Congress. That's why they're able to get these acts passed. Republicans were strongly opposed to this, but as a minority, they couldn't really stop it from being passed. Now, the rationale, remember, is to protect the United States from enemy subversion, particularly from France. And they have a point here. France has already demonstrated their willingness to try and actively recruit in our country, and they've attacked our ships. So France has already kind of positioned itself as an enemy of the United States, despite the fact that the Republicans still support them. Or despite all this, the Republicans still support France. And so the Federalists are concerned that the Republicans might actually turn against the United States. So they are trying to undermine Republican opposition to this war with France. In the end, what they end up doing is about 25 people are going to be put on trial for sedition, accused of sedition. And almost all of these people are going to be the editors of Republican newspapers. So here again, they are speaking at the Republican newspapers, speaking critically of the Federalist war against this quasi-war against France and so forth. And they're going to be charged with sedition. About 10 of them are actually going to be sent to prison over this. So this is going to cause a lot of problems within our own government. And of course, this will divide the American people as well, because a lot of American people are still sympathetic toward France. And this is gonna be very divisive. These Alien and Sedition Acts are going to be very divisive within our government, and cause a lot of problems, a lot of political problems. So here, again, we see how things going on in Europe. This European war has created a dramatic rift within our own government over whether or not we should support the war and whose side we should support if we did. So a lot of problems here as a result of external forces. Now, the Republicans are in kind of a precarious situation here. They can't just go around openly criticizing these Alien and Sedition Acts because they themselves might be arrested for sedition. So they have to tread very carefully in terms of how they want to oppose these Alien and Sedition Acts, because they are strongly opposed to it. They disagree with it. They believe that it's a violation of the First Amendment, which it is. So they've got a valid point here, and they want their argument to be heard. But it's kind of pointless for them to argue it in Congress, since they are the minority. There's no way they can gain enough support to overturn these laws. So in an attempt to make their voices heard, they take their appeal to the state governments. This Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are both propositions or resolutions. Basically, a resolution is just a statement. It's not necessarily a proposal for a law or a bill or a call to action. It is simply a statement. So they issue these statements, these resolutions, to the Virginia and the Kentucky state governments. And as it happens, Virginia and Kentucky were both controlled by Republican majorities. So there's a welcome audience for these letters of protest within these two states. So James Madison, who is also another staunch Republican, he presents this Virginia resolution to the Virginia state legislature. In it, Madison argues that a state government has the authority to judge the constitutionality of a federal law. And he doesn't provide a lot of specific examples of how exactly a state can go about doing this, but it's his opinion that the state has the authority to judge whether or not a federal law is constitutional. And one of the reasons, later on, Madison will clarify this. He will go on to say that a state can organize opposition to a federal law, and if enough state governments can organize themselves enough with petitions and other documents, that they can bring pressure on the federal government through their representatives in the Senate to try and overturn this law. He doesn't make this clear when he first proposes this. He just basically comes out and says that states can judge whether or not a federal law is constitutional. He leaves it kind of open-ended and then clarifies later on. Thomas Jefferson, in his presentation to the Kentucky state legislature, is quite a bit more radical. Now, usually we don't think of Jefferson as being a radical, but this Kentucky resolution, in it he proposes some radical ideas. Jefferson's position is that a state government can nullify a federal law within its borders if it believes it to be unconstitutional. So he's kind of building on Madison's argument here that if a state judges a law to be unconstitutional, then it can nullify that law within its own state. So using our example of Kentucky here, let's say the state of Kentucky believes that the Alien and Sedition Act is unconstitutional. Then the Kentucky state government can vote to nullify that law within the state of Kentucky, basically saying that this law we don't agree with this law, so it doesn't apply to us. Now, in both of these cases, the Virginia resolution and the Kentucky resolution, neither of these, Madison or Jefferson, neither of these men are calling for action. Madison and Jefferson are not trying to start a civil war here. They're not trying to undermine the federal government. They are simply trying to make sure that the voice of opposition has an audience. They believe that these Alien and Sedition Acts are unconstitutional. And they believe not only that it violates citizens' First Amendment rights, but it also violates the 10th Amendment rights of the states. So this is one of the first big debates over states' rights here. To what extent do the individual states have the authority to resist the federal government? And that's the core issue here. In both Madison's Virginia resolution and Jefferson's Kentucky resolution, they are arguing the extent to which a state can have the right to resist federal law. So this idea of states' rights is first fully articulated in this debate over the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, no other states will join Virginia and Kentucky in echoing these resolutions. No action is taken. Nobody officially nullifies anything. So this is just a discussion, a conversation. And again, that's what a resolution is. It's not a call to action. It's not a proposal for law. It is just simply a statement. So in both cases here, the Republicans are just trying to make sure that their voice of opposition is heard in this debate over Alien and Sedition Acts. What will end up happening, though, is even though Jefferson was not suggesting that anybody should actually nullify a federal law, the idea of nullification is going to become part of the national politics. There's going to be a recurring debate over this idea of nullification. It's going to go on for years, and there'll be a handful of incidents in the years that follow where states will actually try to nullify federal laws, and it creates a lot of problems. And as we'll talk about when we get to Andrew Jackson, down the road here, during Andrew Jackson's administration, South Carolina will try and nullify a trade law or a tariff, and that's gonna create enough tension between the federal government and the state government of South Carolina to where we'll almost be ready for some sort of a civil war at that point. So this idea of nullification is not going away. Even though nothing happens as a result of it here in this situation, once it's said, it cannot be unsaid. Once Jefferson articulates this idea of nullification, it's out there. It cannot be retracted, and people start thinking about it, and it's going to cause problems later on down the road. To kind of sum up here, to put a lid on all this, hardline Federalists in Congress are still calling for war throughout Adams' presidency. This debate over the war in Europe is going to continue to go on for several more years. In fact, it's not going to be resolved within the space of Adams' single-term presidency. This debate will continue on into Jefferson's presidency, as we'll talk about in our next session. But it's important to note that even though the nation was very divided under Adams' presidency, and we had a lot of diplomatic crises, Adams did accomplish some things. He did the steps that he took did keep us out of war, and that's important because America is not ready for war at this point. So he saved us the trouble of actually going to war with England or France, and he also with his expansion of our military, he enabled us or he put us in a situation where we were better able to defend ourselves against these attacks without having to actually form an alliance with either country. So that's important. Some accomplishments were made, and of course, also by 1799. France had finally agreed to relent on their attacks of our ships. The Quasi-War comes to a close. Basically, in that year that followed, 1798 and 1800, that Quasi-War will come to a close. France will finally will formalize a peace arrangement between us and France, and we will stop that Quasi-War. So some good things did happen as a result of Adams' administration, but in the balance, the nation was left very divided, especially over issues of foreign policy. And our two political parties, Federalists and Republicans, are now more fiercely opposed to each other than they ever were before. And that's kind of what sets the stage for the next election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800, and that's where we'll pick things up in our next session. So until then, we'll leave it at that.